It doesn't seem to matter where you live. Whether you live in the hustle and bustle of the city, or a nice quiet life out in a small town, these cryptid creatures seem to be lurking around every corner and in every shadow. Today, these subscribers sent in their creepiest allegedly true experiences with cryptid creatures. As always, if you have a story you'd like to share in a future video, whether it be with a cryptid creature or something else, be sure to send it in to the website or the email that you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story. Now, let's dive into these truly creepy experiences with cryptid creatures. Hi, my name is Dustin, and I have a story I need to get off my chest. It's lived with me for a long time now, festering within myself. I'm haunted by it, which is why I fear blacking out. It all started one Saturday night. My parents were out on a dinner date, and had the place to myself. Lucky for me, I'm an only child, so I don't have to worry about watching or babysitting anyone while my folks are away. Date nights were an every Saturday occurrence, which I believed my parents did to mend a broken marriage. Honestly though, I didn't care. I always felt if they wanted to get a divorce, they should just do it. Eventually, once I graduated from high school, they did get divorced, claiming they didn't want a divorce to distract and affect me from my academics or whatever. This is why they claim to have waited. That's great and all, but I was awake to hear nightly arguments, and I heard about how they truly felt about one another long ago. They couldn't stand one another, and these arguments always made me secretly feel horrible about myself. My parents were miserable, and I felt guilty because I felt like I was the reason they were even together, and as such, miserable. I, of course, found out I was right, at least in regards to being the reason they stayed together until I was out of high school. That, however, is beside the point. I lived in a town beside a small lake and was alone in my room watching a horror movie, which was common for my Saturday nights. I was watching Night of the Living Dead. It was playing on my old 90s television set. Nothing fancy like the TVs of today. No, it had one of those big backs and was stupid heavy. I was basically killing time at this point. I was really waiting with my telescope by the window, waiting for my neighbor, Rebecca, to get into her pajamas. She was so oblivious when it came to our window, which was perfect for a young pubescent kid like myself at the time. Before I go any further, I realize now what I was doing was very wrong. Hey, hormones make you do some crazy things sometimes. Hell, I used to steal my dad's porno mags and hide them under my bed for my own use later. At any rate, my clock in my room read 10 o'clock on the dot, and as such, it was time to get into position. I quickly moved from my bed to the chair, peering into the telescope as I did. There she was, the most beautiful woman I could possibly set my eyes on at that moment. Rebecca was in bed, removing her makeup that I never believed she truly needed. I'd always believed she was quite beautiful without any of that. She had long blonde hair, perfect dark eyebrows. Her blue eyes were a real showstopper, and her breasts were quite large. I felt like I was in heaven, but at the same time, I didn't feel it was time yet, so I moved back to watching my film for a bit. Suddenly, the lights flickered twice, and then all went dark. I initially jumped at the sudden loss of lights, but I'd been here before and knew what to do, and so I headed for the circuit breaker, which my dad taught me how to work previously. I grabbed my mag light and headed downstairs into the basement. Upon arrival, my flashlight flickered a bit, but I smacked it and fixed. I used to use this flashlight to play tag with my friends, and at one point, I fell hard and got some wicked raspberries on my knees as a result. The light flew out of my hand when this happened, and ever since it would occasionally flicker when in use. Once I reached the circuit box, I quickly found the switch that I was looking for and flipped it. Nothing. I tried flipping it back and forth a couple more times, but still, nothing. Confused, I went upstairs to see if maybe the neighbor's power had gone out as well. I looked outside. I saw a bunch of my neighbors talking about what I assumed was the power, since I saw a bunch of street lamps out. My neighbors always seemed like kind people, and they'd always wave at me when they looked down my way. But I never dared interact with them. As such, I decided to open my window a bit and eavesdrop on their conversation instead. The conversation confirmed my suspicions, as one of my neighbors said he'd seen the transformer blow. Great, I thought to myself. It'd be forever before they restored power. Looking at the grandfather clock is when I realized what I was missing. I ran upstairs and looked up through my telescope. I could barely make out anything in my neighbor's room, but I noticed the faint outline of her pulling her pajama bottoms up and cursed at myself for missing it all. Since I'd missed out, I decided to walk away from my peeping Tom window and over to the other one to eavesdrop on the neighbors again. A crowd of people had formed outside of my house now. I saw the Robinsons from the 2 doors down, Rebecca's dad, who was my neighbor to the right of me, and Dan, my neighbor to the left. There were a few others outside, but I couldn't tell who they were because they were all wearing hooded jackets. I soon noticed one of the Robinsons pointing towards the woods, and upon following her finger, I noticed a light appear to litter the edge of the woods. I moved back and took my telescope away from my peeping Tom window before setting up in front of the window towards the woods. Adjusting the focus, I froze when I saw what was in the woods. Standing at the edge of the woods were tall, pitch-black figures with bulbous heads, a bit like barn owls, and their eyes, they were like painted-over globes, all white in appearance. The hands of these creatures were exceptionally large, connected to arms that fell listily to their sides. Outside of this, they had no distinct features. These creatures just stood there, swaying back and forth, watching my neighbors. No doubt freaked out by this, Rebecca's dad shouted,
"That's it. I'm getting my gun."
He then turned towards his house and headed inside. Rebecca's dad was well-known in the area for his temper. He always got angry over little things. I once saw him punt his lawn gnome over the fence just because it fell over when he was walking by it. I always imagined no one messed with him, because it was likely he was the Incredible Hulk and would turn into him when extremely angry. It didn't take long for him to return from his home with the hunting rifle he used on bucks.
"If one of those mofos sets foot on my lawn, I'm going to blow its goddamn head off. You hear?"
At this announcement from Rebecca's dad, the neighbors kept their eyes set on the creatures near the woods. Observing these creatures, I watched as they swayed back and forth before realizing they never once blinked. The creatures would just stare with their glowing eyes, but it was impossible to tell exactly who or what they were looking at, as none of their eyes had pupils. I honestly couldn't tell you what these things were, but I could definitely tell you they weren't human. Soon enough, one of the creatures began taking long, sluggish strides forward. It was in the street now, walking ever closer to my neighbors when I aimed my telescope at one of the creatures. They were also beginning to move forward. In the same manner, one after another, they seemed to move slowly, almost like the zombies I'd seen in the movie I'd been watching. Rebecca's dad aimed his rifle at one of the creatures before declaring his intent to fire if they moved any closer towards him or his neighbors. The creature he aimed at didn't even flinch, but instead kept progressing closer. Rebecca's dad let out a warning shot into the air. In surprise at the sudden sound, my neighbors and I put our hands over our ears. After a few moments, I looked out the window, no longer needing a telescope to see the creatures moving towards Rebecca's dad. He took a few steps back and aimed his rifle at the creature, who still remained unfazed by his threats. Looking more closely at the creature, I could see it had to be at least 7 feet tall.
"I warned you."
Rebecca's dad yelled before pulling the trigger on his rifle and shooting the creature in the center of its chest. The thing is, though, the creature had no wound and the bullet had passed straight through it. There wasn't even a speck of blood to be seen. The creature took another stride forward, moving only inches from Rebecca's dad, who felt fear and anger as he closed his eyes, firing off another shot. That's when the thing walked right past him, towards their home. His fatherly instincts kicking in, Rebecca's dad went after the beast as it walked right up to his house and opened the door. I soon saw the other creatures moving forward, before hearing a gunshot and Rebecca's screams from next door. I quickly moved my telescope back and looked towards their home. Rebecca had lit candles in her room, and there was a light just enough to see her screaming in horror as she threw objects at the shadowy creature inside the room. A lamp, books, anything Rebecca could grab as he hurled it at the creature, who just stood there as the objects flew through it. The creature soon put its hands around Rebecca's shoulder, at which point she stopped screaming. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head, and her arms fell to her sides. Rebecca became completely still for a moment before walking towards the door with the creature, who I now noticed was looking directly at me. I shuddered, backing away from the telescope before trying to look again, only to realize they'd already walked out the door. I started panicking. It definitely saw me, and I hope I'm not next. Looking back to the street, I saw the other strange creatures entering my neighbors' homes. I also saw Rebecca walking towards the woods with one of the creatures close behind her. Soon enough, more creatures emerged from my neighbor's home, and I saw my neighbors going with them, towards the woods as well, including a little girl from a few doors down. As I watched all my neighbors going with these creatures towards the woods, I hadn't even noticed that one was entering my own home. I heard the downstairs door shut and I froze. Thinking I was next, I quickly began looking for places to hide within my room. As I did, I bumped my dresser and my mag light fell and rolled beneath the bed. I quickly followed it, moving magazines and old socks before huddling up with the flashlight underneath my bed and against the wall. I waited, and soon enough I heard the thing enter my room. Sitting underneath my bed and against the wall didn't give me the best view, but I soon saw pitch black legs step into the center of the room. I tried to focus as my brain kept imagining that the thing was finding me and turning me into a lifeless zombie like Rebecca and my neighbors. I soon saw the creature get down on its knees, making no sound as it looked under the bed. The eyes were bright like two full moons, and it glared at me as it reached under the bed and I backed against the wall, praying it couldn't touch me. It continued reaching. Its arm was appearing to grow longer and longer as it did. I watched in silent fear as it tried to fit its head underneath the bed. I closed my eyes, hoping for a miracle as I felt the thing's hands get closer and closer, when the miracle I hoped for came. My flashlight flickered to life, and upon touching the creature, made it jump back, wincing in pain. It opened its mouth as this happened, allowing me to see there was a light within it, much like the eyes themselves. This was followed by a loud foghorn-like noise that came from the creature. I clutched my ears as it reeled back in what I can only guess was pain. The monster's face then cracked as it backed away from my bed. It let out one final yell before running out of my room, and then my home. When I finally felt it safe enough, I crawled out from underneath my bed, flashlight in hand, and looked out the window. The creatures were leading those they'd captured towards the lake. I ran out of the house and past my gawking neighbors who seemed confused as to what to do. I screamed, "They don't like the light," as I ran past them. I quickly made my way through the woods, tripping a few times as I did before making it to the lake, ready to scream at my neighbors about the creature's fear of light when I saw something that made me freeze. The creatures were now walking over the shoulders of my neighbors into the water, at which point my neighbors were willingly sinking into the water as well. My neighbors continued sinking until all remained were ripples of water from where they had entered, then nothing. Confused and waiting for an hour that seemed like an eternity, the remaining neighbors not taken by the creatures looked confused. A few tried going into the water to see if they could find anything or anyone, but they couldn't find anything. Soon after, my neighbors called the police and they began filing missing people's reports. The unspoken truth of the matter was, even though they were filing reports, we all knew inside we'd never see the missing again. The lake was eventually drained to find the bodies of the missing, but there were no bodies to be found, no sign of anything. This left us all with more questions than answers. Rebecca's father was found on his living room floor unconscious, having a heart attack before slipping into a coma. I still believe this was the creature's doing, and eventually, his family decided to pull the plug on him after they determined he was brain dead. He died exactly 1 year after the disappearance of Rebecca. It's safe to say I no longer live anywhere near a lake. I became obsessed with the idea that the creatures that lived down there would eventually come back for me, and eventually my parents moved far away from the lake. I have trouble sleeping now because of the nightmares I have about the creatures leading me into the lake, drowning me. I can also still hear the foghorn-like bellow of the creatures inside my head. I doubt I'll ever forget that sound. I consider myself very lucky to be alive today, and I feel if I had not had my flashlight flickering on when it did, I'd very likely be dead today, unable to retell my story. So if you ever live near a lake, be forewarned. They emerge from the woods and they don't like the light. This event took place in September of 2017. I was visiting my longtime friend Mark, who was going to college about 4 or 5 hours away from where I lived, on the West Coast. Mark's girlfriend, Karen, and another one of our friends, Shin, packed up a car and drove out on a Friday afternoon. The drive was uneventful for the most part. At one point, we held condoms out of the car window going 90 miles per hour, and we parked roadside to watch one hell of a sunset. We arrived late that night and met up with Mark, who gave us a tour of his dorm. Again, uneventful, after an hour or two of playing pool in the rec room. Mark and Karen declared they needed some alone time that night, and the next as Mark's roomie would be out of town. Shin and I didn't love the idea of paying for a hotel, but Karen convinced Mark to pay for one for us so they would have privacy for the next couple of days. Shin and I were cool with this, and so we left for our hotel. Upon arrival at the room, Shin starts up a Skype call with his girlfriend, who couldn't make the trip. I asked him if he wanted to go out to the farmland outside of the town for some long exposure shots of the stars, but he declined. I was bummed at this news as I didn't know how to work a camera for the long exposure shots just yet, and I really needed Shin's help. That's when I remembered that part of the state I was in. There was nothing but small towns and rolling hills for miles. Freight trains in the middle of the field are easier to paint than in the industrial district of a major city with no one around, besides the occasional college couple trying to be taboo. Yes, I do paint trains when I have time and money. You paint a train and it travels all over the continent. Some people do drugs for their high, while I see panels of trains traveling to cities I'll never see and get high off that. Small world stuff, you know? Anyways, I let Shin in on my plans, and got to the keys to the car, which Karen let us borrow, and left the hotel. I stocked up on paint at Walmart before driving through a couple of towns and rough areas. I spent probably about an hour and a half looking. I scanned the railroad tracks in both towns as I passed through, but sadly no freight cars for which to create my art on. My sadness did not last long, however, as I entered the third town and found several hoppers and gondolas parked between the wheat fields. I soon parked at a gas station and went off behind it, into the darkness ahead, trying to scan for cars that didn't have paint on them already. I eventually found an old Canadian grain car, one of my favorites, and began going through my bag of paint to start an outline. I quickly find some gloss white paint and begin working and setting up my milk crate, so I can reach higher parts on the train. 15 minutes into painting, I hear a low gurgling sound about 10 to 20 yards to my 9 o'clock position. I look around, afraid if some farmer has found me or maybe a gas station attendant is on his break. Strangely, however, I only see a single tree, and the darkness at the edge of the fields. I debate using a flashlight, but I decide against it, worried someone will see the light and I'll get in trouble. The gargling sound soon stops, but then picks up in 3 to 5 second intervals. I began to become extremely curious about the source of the noise, as it was about 2 or 3 in the morning, and I began thinking, no one else could possibly be around. I used my hand to cover the LED light as I turned over my flashlight, before flipping it on, pointing it at my chest first, then my feet, and finally the tree. The moment I did this, the gargling noise faded out. There was a dried up embankment between myself and the tree. That figured must be a farm runoff due to the familiar smell of cow patties in the air. I say familiar because I used to live on a farm in the Midwest for about a year. The only thing I noticed in the embankment is a funny, fuzzy, tan bump. I didn't wish to walk towards it, so I instead climbed up the ladder on the hopper I was painting. As I'm climbing, I can't help but feel like I'm being watched. As a sense of dread overcomes me, while my back is to this thing, and I'm climbing. Taking a look back at the gas station, I see no one. The only cars in the parking lot were mine and whoever the attendant was at the station. I stared into the parking lot. I suddenly hear a rustling behind me. I turn, flipping my flashlight on him once again, only to realize the tan thing in the embankment was a dead deer. From a higher position, and upon further examination, I realized it wasn't as tan as I thought it was initially. I could see a slight gray and purple, which assumed was the start of decomposition of the animal. There was quite a bit of blood from a small wound in the deer's belly, which bled out into the dirt below the body. As I stared at the deer, I hear a sudden snap which jolts me, and I quickly climb to the top of the train car and watch closely at the tree in the distance. I found myself frozen in place as I tried to visualize what I was looking for. I was trying to get any sort of movement, but that's when I saw it. In a small area between all the branches in the lower left area of the tree, I saw little beads of white ice shine move into place. At first, I assumed it was a possum or a raccoon, but eventually it became obvious it was much too large to be either, and this gave me chills. I kept thinking to myself, no, as this thing parted branches in what I assumed was a way to get better view of me. Getting a better look at the creature, I noticed it is smaller than I initially thought. Skinny, and it's gray with a humanoid-like figure. Standing on top of the train, I shivered as this creature opened its mouth and let out the identical sound to a cockroach hiss. As soon as I heard the sound, I got the hell off the train and made a beeline for my car. I heard one last faint hiss as I made it to the lights that lit up the gas station parking lot. Jumping in my car, I sped off, blasting music and using my brights all the way back to the college town. I was more hysterical than scared as I fantasized about a gray humanoid creature popping out in front of me as I sped down the road. In the end, I made it back safely, but I broke one of the passenger side speakers in Karen's vehicle from blasting music so loudly and for so long. I remembered that I also left spare cans of spray paint in the milk crate back at the train cars when leaving in a panic. I kicked myself at the thought of that spot would be compromised now, as they'd no doubt have security out there in the future. Eventually, I figured it was for the better, however, as I didn't want anyone experiencing what I did out there. Due to the events of that night, I always stick to cities now when creating my art. I figured I'd rather run into a thug than whatever I ran into that night. Please take a weapon and a friend if you wish to wander out into the boonies. You never know who or what you'll run into. My name is Mick, and I'm a father of 3 boys who works full-time and has a wife in college. The days move fast here. The date was October 9th, 2010, and I was doing senior pictures for a friend's son. Quick background on me. I'm not a hunter or a camper, but when given the chance, I like to hike. This doesn't make me an outdoorsman by any means, although I do live in the country. My friend's son wished to do his pictures at a secluded lake outside of Amanda, Ohio, in a place called Written Rock. The lake is Lake Ramona, and is part of a state park. In fact, most of my county is designated as a state park. I wasn't the most familiar with the area, but thankfully my wife drove and we had our 5-year-old son with us at the time. The day was an unseasonably warm 80 degrees out when we arrived at about noon. Parking along the road, we only noticed about one other car, a red Chevy, down the road a little way. We had to make our way through a dense path and up a little hill to get to the edge of the lake. I remember when we reached the top, quite vividly because it was completely silent outside of something throwing rocks into the lake. Brushing off the eerie feeling I had, I got to work taking pictures. The area around the lake was beautiful and surrounded by trees as far as we could see. The hills that rose around the lake and trees were already turning yellow and orange. I was quite happy knowing the background would look so perfect. My wife and son went off and began walking along the edge of the lake, and I worked for about 5 or 6 minutes before being distracted by a sound coming from the lake itself. I tried to keep working, but I couldn't help but feel like something wasn't right. The sound continued to emanate from the lake and ripples appeared from within the water. I tried to cast it off as someone trying to scare us as I moved closer to the lake with the kid I was doing pictures for and continued working. We soon began to notice there weren't any fish around or anything that should be creating ripples. And at that moment, the kid began to get nervous and asked to leave. His dad soon said he saw a black face on the opposite side of the lake. I only saw black eyes and assumed it was a raccoon or something, but I began to get nervous as my pregnant wife and son were missing. Thankfully, it didn't take long for them to show up on a path opposite the way they left, but a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach was still growing. I didn't want to panic anyone, and so I told everyone we needed to head out and pointed towards our Jeep. I then stayed with the boy for a minute while he and his dad explained what they saw. I still couldn't see anything, and wanted to leave when a sound went through the trees that sounded like a stick being hit on a tree. Hearing this, I pushed everyone out faster and further away from the lake. The sounds of sticks breaking were soon followed by a thumping, which made me think something might be headed our way. Before turning and headed down the path, I took a series of images across the side of the hill where we noticed movement. Not taking time to actually look to see a person or whatever was out there, I figured that was a task I could do from the safety of my home later if I caught something in the photos I took. It's important to note that through this whole experience, I never believed in Bigfoot or Grassman. If I turned 90 degrees, I could see the road. We weren't in a forest interior. Plus, this was Ohio, and we don't have creatures like that here to my knowledge. At least, none that were known of. I hoped I could find proof of whatever was out there. It was sometime after midnight that night, while going through the several senior pictures I had taken, that I found the jet black image. At the time, I wasn't a believer, my luck usually doesn't run like that. A Bigfoot nearby me with a camera. Yeah, right, I thought. Turns out I was wrong though. I did capture a jet black image, 2 images in fact. It was something that to this day I still can't explain, even when looking into unknown primates. Thank you for reading my account. These things definitely do exist. I went on a deer hunt with my dad, brother, and 2 brothers-in-law to the southern part of the Kisatchie National Forest. I worked the night before in a haunted house inside an old Gothic jail, and I got in bed around 2 o'clock in the morning and had to wake up at 4:30 to go hunting. So needless to say, I was quite tired at this point. We got there at around 5, and by 5:45, I had set up a stand and climbed out about 25 feet off the ground. I lit a joint and relaxed to the crickets, frogs, and chirps from the flying squirrels as they jumped from branch to branch. I nodded off for several minutes. I was soon awakened by the sound of a woman screaming. I bolted up in my stand, terrified. I realized quickly that there was probably a panther nearby. The light was just creeping through the trees when I heard it scream again, at which point I sat extremely still. I may have been high in a tree, but panthers are vicious animals, and I did not want this thing to notice me. It wasn't long before I heard the sounds of sticks and leaves cracking, and I knew it was footsteps. I took my Remington 270 off safety and readied myself for a fight, feeling something was headed my way. Through the trees about 75 yards away, I could see a shape walking in my direction. I looked at it through my scope, but I don't know exactly what I was possibly looking at, because this thing had no features. It was just a black mass in the shape of a man. The air surrounding it was warped. It looked as if its body was sucking the light into itself. It kept getting closer to me. It was about 20 yards away when it stopped straight in front of me and looked at me. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its glare. As I watched it just staring back at me, my head began to hurt. I began shaking and I felt like I was going to pass out. My body was numb and my nose started to bleed. Suddenly it let out that same scream I had been hearing, and it turned away and started walking back into the trees. My senses returned and my numbness was gone. My nose still bled. I waited for another hour and a half before I climbed back down and booked it back to the truck. I got in and locked the doors until my family members returned. I haven't told any of them about it, and I don't plan to. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed these creepy tales of cryptid creatures, be sure to hit that like button as it helps me out a ton. If you're new to the swamp, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a new video, as I upload them almost every single day, and all things natural and supernatural. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video. And remember, send your stories in at swampdweller.net. It keeps these videos coming.